Hello everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to this week's Procurement Leaders webinar. My name is Ian Lawless. I'm Head of Content Partnerships and Event Director here at Procurement Leaders. As ever, delighted to be with you all. And today we are looking at the fifth and final topic within our glide path reports this year, and we're focusing on resilience and what that's looked like for the Procurement Leaders community across the course of 2025. We've done some really interesting work in this space this year. Even in our strategic planning guide, we identified that third-party risk management was becoming the function's second biggest priority after delivering cost savings. And for the third consecutive year, there's no doubting the central importance there of resilience to procurement's value proposition. So we're seeing that more limited resources with a growing regulatory pressure and environment and some pretty complex supply chains, all presenting those long-standing challenges to procurement teams who are attempting to make headway in this space. Then it's become pretty clear, or less clear, how the function can really rise to meet what can be sometimes feel like insurmountable challenges. So organisations are having to really think carefully about where they invest their resources, have discussions in exactly that space, and think as well about how they can be innovative in this area and work with their teams to enable success and progress. So a big topic, a big area of focus for us in a continually volatile world. And I've got a really great panel with me today who can make, hopefully, some more sense of this for all of us. I have no doubt they'll do exactly that. So really happy to be joined today by Harry John, who is Principal Analyst here at Procurement Leaders and who authored a lot of the work we did in this space and our reports in the resilience space this year for Procurement Leaders, and Darren Lynch, VP of Supply Chain Procurement at GEP, who have been a fantastic thought partner for us this year, not just across this research, but across the entire year with all of our event programs as well, and continue to be an outstanding partner with Procurement Leaders on a day-to-day basis. So really happy to have you both with us here today to really dive into what you're seeing in the procurement leaders community, but also in the GEP global customer base. So maybe just a quick welcome from both of you, and to introduce yourselves with your roles to the audience today. So Darren, I'll come to you first.
Sure, thank you. Pleasure to be here again. Darren Lynch is my name. I look after our European and Middle Eastern business, and I'm a senior member of our supply chain leadership group globally. And been with GEP since about 2016, and spent most of my time working on supply chain planning and resilience projects, among other, strategic cost reduction projects. So I should be here.
Thanks very much, Darren. Good to have you with us. And Harry, would you mind introducing yourself to the audience today as well?
Sure. Thanks, Ian. Hi, everyone on the line. Good to be here. I've been with Procurement Leaders for about 11 years now. I spend most of my time as principal analyst looking at our research themes, resilience being one of them, and looking forward to getting into the content today. Thanks, Ian.
Absolutely. Thank you both. We'll get straight into it in just a moment. But a lot of things we're going to explore today. So we're going to look at how some of the key findings that we've seen across the year and look at prioritization across sub-tier suppliers, look at how you promote sub-tier transparency, and also look at how we can turn visibility into accountability, actionability. So there's a lot we're going to cover and much more. As ever, this is interactive. A lot of you have actually already sent in your questions ahead of this session today as well, so please do as we go. We'll answer some of those, and we'll answer more as we can get through them. And as ever, any technical difficulties, please do let me and the team know through the help section there, and we'll be able to support. And hopefully we'll be very smooth sailing for everybody on the line today. But I'm just going to do maybe just a bit of positioning from me before we dive into the specifics around resilience. As I mentioned, this is the fifth of the sessions that we've done now this year to close out the year with a lot of the research that Procurement Leaders has been engaged in on our theme that has focused on glide paths for sustainable growth, this overarching topic of Horizon 2030. We've really seen that 2030 is a pretty pivotal time horizon with a lot of UN Sustainable Development Goals, a lot of net zero decarbonisation targets linked intrinsically to it. And we've put a lot of emphasis on the work that we can do to support the procurement leaders community and procurement at large across the short, medium and longer term. So Well, a lot of work that we've done this year has allowed us to focus on these 5 glide path areas, these 5 areas of strategic priority, with ESG, resilience, performance, partnerships, and digitalization being the 5 that we have spent a lot of time focusing on. And we've established a bit of a 2030 destination, which I'll come to in a moment, as well as an in-year ambition that we try and focus on, of which this was one of those in resilience this year, very much around mapping to tier 2. We know, though, that not one member or one organization's journey is linear when it comes to progress or maturity in each of these spaces. So a lot of the work that we do helps our members to also find out or get inspiration or connections with others who are at a similar level on their journey, or who might be also looking for inspiration for those who've already achieved some different aspects. So we have a lens of maturity to everything that we do in order to help shape the engagements that we put on for all of our content, but also for how we can support all the members on their journeys also. And how that materializes, I mentioned kind of the in-year ambition and that longer term horizon. In 2024, we focused on those buckets on the left that you see there, and how within resilience, we have looked a lot at how you map to tier 2, and we'll talk more about how the 2025 ambitions going forward. But ultimately, we'd love to get to a point where we can support all members on resilience and how to get to fully mapped supply chains that have integrated predictive analytics that are used to mitigate disruption and prescribe action. So some ambitions there that we try and aspire to from the procurement leaders community. And as ever, talent and capability, this sits across everything, right? It's incredibly important that we look to upskill every aspect of our organizations in each of these strategic glide path areas. So we do an awful lot of work to address how talent and capability can be managed and the demand within it for organizations. So I give that a bit of context as we dive in, Harry, a little bit deeper now to look specifically at the resilience topic and the work that we've done this year. You want to kick us off with our conversation as to how and something that's stood out this year with the work that we have done, and that's been around prioritization of suppliers. So I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so as we will see throughout the remainder of the presentation, this, it's a complex and difficult task to obtain information on sub-tier suppliers that might be 2, 3, or more layers removed from your organization. So the ability to prioritize and deploy resources where they are going to deliver the most return is an important part of this. But before we get into the content on that, I've got a couple of context slides. This one shows how we surveyed the membership on a similar topic back in 2016, looking at the distribution of past supply disruptions by probability and impact. And what we found 8 years ago, that it was actually what we called at the time the micro risks, which caused most supply disruptions. So those low probability, low impact risks that mounted up to create, as it suggests on the slide here, the most common types of disruptions. But we asked the same question with the survey for this report in 2024, and what we found is that the supply risk landscape has changed over the last 8 years, and it's actually now those low probability, high impact events which make up the majority of past disruptions. So, or what people call the black swans. And if you think about events that have occurred since 2016, we've had Brexit, the COVID-19 pandemic, Russia's war in Ukraine, escalating conflict in the Middle East. Risk managers' lived reality has been one of kind of seismic geopolitical event after another. So in this more fractious, more complicated political environment where that well-established order is changing along with trade dynamics, sub-tier visibility actually becomes increasingly important to mitigating compliance and geopolitical risk. In spite of this, meaningful visibility for most in the Procurement Leaders membership, at least, remains a distant reality. We've asked this question, or a version of this question, in surveys numerous times in recent years, and the answer is the same every single time. You look beyond tier 1, and it's really very difficult to get a clear picture of not only who those tier 2 or tier 3 suppliers are, but what their connection is to your tier 1 suppliers. And it's in this context that, well, it's this kind of mismatch between the growing demands and the growing need to improve oversight of risks in extended supply chains on the one hand, and the relatively limited capabilities that at least our research suggests procurement teams have on the other, that we wanted to address with this research. And to do that, we've developed this three-part action plan, which we will reveal in full over the course of the webinar. But for now, we'll look at the first kind of phase of this action plan, which has to do with prioritizing suppliers. We've developed this based on PL research insight as well as community insight into what members in the Procurement Leaders Network are doing, what we found works, and we've developed these short, medium, and long-term actions that teams can take to make progress in this area. So, in the short term, it's about ascertaining exposure to and responsibilities under due diligence regulations. The regulatory environment is one of the, if not the main driver that is forcing companies to improve their oversight of extended supply chains. There's a whole host of different regulations around the world, many of which don't necessarily gel very neatly with one another. So there's quite a large amount of work to do there to understand, the responsibilities and obligations under those regulations. In the medium term, it's about concentrating your efforts on those issues that have to do with compliance under those rules and adjusting risk assessments accordingly. So, if you're looking at forced labor, conflict minerals, or environmental issues like deforestation, for example, you're going to be looking at upweighting country and material risk factors in those risk assessments. And then over the longer term, companies should expand sub-tier discovery to operationally critical suppliers using impact-based assessments to identify high-risk vendors. And I just got a quick example to illustrate, what we mean by impact-based risk assessments. So one company that's doing this in our network is Schneider Electric. Back in 2021, they underwent a process of about 3 to 4 months of mapping revenue impact of their suppliers. They employed a consultant company to help them do this, developed a model which mapped the revenue impact of around 100,000 parts that they purchased from suppliers across 40 production lines, which led them to about 300 to 400 critical suppliers in the North America region. They then surveyed those suppliers on their capacity constraints, including constraints relating to sub-tier suppliers, so their sourcing activities, and then developed a set of mitigating actions. And what this helped them to do is to target their risk countermeasures to those suppliers that mattered the most to the company's top line. In more recent years, what Schneider's done is to deploy technology to expand its supply mapping to around 14,000 suppliers, including 700 critical sub-tier suppliers. So it's improved its reach and its ability to look into the sub-tiers of the supply chain.
Thanks, Harry. I'll come in here to Darren. I'd love to get your take on this before we move on to kind of promoting the sub-tier transparency topic. But from your perspective, from GEP's kind of a global community base, kind of what are you seeing here? Are you hearing something similar? Kind of anything to build on? Kind of what Harry's just shared with us from the procurement leader side.
Yeah. Just to build upon it. So certainly in the last 12 months, there's been a lot more uptake in people taking this a little bit more proactively. So, traditionally, whether you come from a manufacturing base or not, or you may be regulated industry, certainly more regulation is creating a demand for transparency in the supply chain. So, who do you think you are? Who do you think your suppliers are? And where they get in to make sure, and that's driven from initial, sanctions lists, to your point, making sure that you're regulatory compliant, ethically, environmentally sourcing, for example, and trying to find out where are those sources, right? Tier 1 suppliers, certainly, and just understanding who your tier 1 suppliers, who their major suppliers as it relates to your key revenues, right? Or key production lines and critical path. So a lot of people are doing, we've certainly spent time doing a lot of kind of value chain mapping and understanding then what are the critical points of failure. and then mapping out, just current tier 1 and going into tier 2 suppliers. Certainly seen an uptake in that in the last while. And more recently, obviously, with the US election, I think there was a question in our chat box that relates to it as well. So what's been going on proactively? A lot of global organizations, obviously, where we have, where there's lots of global production and distribution, tax and trade flow mapping, scenario modeling and planning is happening right now for all of us. And really then the strategy that we see is a little bit of wait and see, obviously, but that does require procurement planning for, scenario 1, scenario 2. So if things like if US tariffs impact potentially core production locations, certain product ranges, say from China, what's the impact? But also is there impact then in Europe or in Latin America? There's talk of lots of sanctions. You have lots of not sanctions, tariffs. And so what does that mean? What's the planning? So understanding your flows, understanding where your core revenue is as it relates to production areas. That's certainly a key thing that's happening right now. And understanding then, if I have to regionalize and I need to provide visibility, do I understand and start to work with my suppliers? Can they help me if I need to switch production, for example, in terms of locations? So a lot more planning, supply planning, understanding customer demand, key contracts, and understanding the commitments. Obviously, you have commitments with suppliers. Your traditional approach is to de-risk it by putting that into contracts. And I think on the maturity curve you were talking about there, we see a lot of there are immediate tactical things that can be done with leveraging your suppliers, asking them for additional information, asking them to confirm compliance, for example, which normally happens today. But it's really about helping the suppliers and doing, if you relate it back to a normal procurement activity, simple should-to cost modeling, right? You're doing that for most of your core categories. So then once you understand that, what is the diversity and options in your supply, whether you're building inventories for multiple suppliers, whether you're doing partial production, it's understanding the impacts of that, and then also how you start to think about systemizing that information from basic manual into more automated activities. I think we'll pause there. We can talk more about it.
Yeah, perfect. I think it's a natural segue. I think absolutely we'll move on to a couple of pieces to know exactly how we go about doing that. But thank you both for kicking us off there as we look at the prioritization of suppliers. Harry, we're going to move to the second part here, which is promoting sub-tier transparency and looking just a little bit deeper really on kind of those methods that are enabling functions to gather that sub-tier data that helps to improve the visibility and look at those limitations and opportunities that are associated with the risk. So yeah, take it away here for us and into the next portion of the main areas of focus we've seen this year in this topic of resilience.
Sure thing, thanks Ian. So I can reveal the second layer of this action plan that we've developed. And as you mentioned there, Darren, in the short term, it's about those kind of tactical one-to-one interactions with suppliers, requesting information from them on their sub-tier vendors, to probably varying levels of success, according to the conversations that we've been involved in as part of this research. Another thing that Procurement Leaders members are doing as a kind of longer term play, I guess, is deploying technology to assist with multi-tier supply chain mapping and risk monitoring, and we can talk more about that, I'm sure. And then over the longer term, it's about expanding those existing procurement procedures to include transparency requirements and clauses. And just to kind of dive into those areas in a little bit more detail, one thing we did as part of this research was to break down, I guess, the kind of main methods that we saw that teams use to go about gaining or obtaining information on their sub-tier suppliers. So on those direct supplier interactions, via survey, email, one-to-one meetings, whatever it might be, this is relatively inexpensive, and assuming that suppliers don't provide you with misleading or inaccurate information, which you can't assume that they always won't, it does provide or produce accurate, reliable data. You're getting primary data direct from the suppliers, so in theory it should be pretty reliable. On the flip side, it's time consuming, it's very manual, and so over a large supply base, many of the companies we work with have tens, hundreds of thousands of suppliers in their supply base, it's obviously not an economically scalable option. Data collected will need to be transformed before it can be used. If you're surveying hundreds of suppliers, you're going to have to clean and store and process that information before you can start to use it, by which time it may be out of date. And as I said, suppliers may be unwilling to disclose. And so really, I guess probably the expected success rate of this tactic over the long term is probably in the low to medium range. There's been, in the last 12 months, probably, at least from the Procurement Leaders membership base, a real explosion of interest in these supply chain mapping technology tools. These, enable buyers to establish connections, often using AI-enabled features between their tier 1 suppliers and their tier 2 and tier 3 suppliers, while also enabling them to monitor risks in near real time. It's obviously more scalable when compared with asking suppliers for this information directly. The risk monitoring features can reduce time to awareness of potential disruptions, which your suppliers may not be aware of, if they're not using similar technologies. And also some of these tools allow you to license the technology freely to your tier 1 suppliers, which potentially creates a disclosure incentive. Although, as some of our members have found, it can be time consuming and difficult to train suppliers in the use of these tools. Generally, they only tend to work with those publicly available data, getting information on privately listed companies in areas of the world, very difficult. They can be expensive, carry a large price tag often. And, one of the common issues that we hear is that the risk monitoring alerts often generate or can generate large numbers of false positives. Now, in some cases, there's a kind of prerequisite here of having really quite comprehensive tier 1 supplier visibility in order to get the most out of these tools. If you don't know where your tier 1 suppliers' main manufacturing locations are, then potentially these tools will generate a lot of false positives. But as I say, generally speaking, when compared with asking suppliers directly for this kind of information, our members are seeing some success in using these technologies. And despite their limitations, I think pretty much everyone who participated in the research agreed that data intelligence is really the only way to do this over the long term. But while everybody kind of awaits the magic tool that's going to give them visibility right back to the nth tier of the supply chain, there's examples of companies in the PR network who are kind of taking the matter into their own hands, and one of which is this agribusiness that we work with. They've incorporated transparency requirements in the source to contract process. So they've expanded those procedures and begun to put the onus on suppliers to disclose, where available, information on their suppliers. So they're starting with their direct material suppliers, those single source vendors, and also those based in or supplying to the company's Europe business, reflecting the regulatory environment there. And what they've done is they've included transparency as a risk factor in the relationship section of their RFP. They ask questions like, are suppliers willing to share their financial information on the principal sub-tier suppliers? And they also require select suppliers to undergo ESG assessments, which include sub-tier supplier disclosure. So again, really, putting the onus on your tier 1 suppliers here to help you generate that map of the tier 2 and tier 3 supply chains.
Perfect. Thanks, Harry. Again, Darren, I'd love to come to you just to get your thoughts on this as well. And maybe kind of as you talked to this a little bit, we've spoken there about kind of some of the needs and the collaboration in working with suppliers. Sometimes there's an unwillingness there about the education piece that's required to bring them along on the journey with you and how best you address that. That's something we had from the audience in a pre-submitted question. So maybe you could just answer that one for us as well as giving your thoughts in this area.
Yeah, sure. So I think Yeah. So supplier education, having linking that to, I think what you referred to earlier there, so supplier relationship management programs, right? So we all have them, we talk about them, but really that focus has always been on your kind of core tier one suppliers, securing raw materials, securing semi-finished goods, really based upon more direct materials, right? And the level of automation, starts at to your point, starts at basically just contract visibility. The more automated people are going, the simplest and most effective way for people is to extend visibility into tier two is through forecast collaboration. So that can be simple, part of integrated planning process where you're providing that weekly, monthly, you're looking at over your short and medium term horizons and getting your supplier to provide visibility of what's in the supply chain in terms of available, is there a production risk, right? That's where things typically start. So, and your core tier one suppliers, they understand that because you're more into long-term partnerships, and you'll do a lot of co-innovation. So it's about educating, using that same skill set that you probably have to develop a supplier education program to be able to extend that. So it's once people understand I'm interested, I'm the buyer, I'm interested in talking to you, I'm interested in understanding who is in the background, because we want to maintain relationships with you, we want to grow, but we need to mitigate risk in the process, but we also need to make sure we maintain and increase transparency to ensure regulation and also customer preference. So we found that now there's a lot of hard work in terms of preparing to educate, how you then go out and do that, tier by tier, category by category, region by region, because these are, typically we have some large supplier databases. But the effect of that, really coupling that with using some of the tools, just simply using your supplier portals that you have, self-service information, and also just proactively monitoring and tracking the uptake, the response levels upon that. They're practical things that do work, but it requires investing and prioritizing some resources to focus on that, right? In the same way as when you change a lot of internal processes, we're introducing an ERP or changing our payment term, changing your payment processes, you need to onboard suppliers, make sure they're aware of changes of how you need to submit purchase orders, invoices, etc. Same principles apply. A lot of hard work in physically chasing suppliers to make sure they are submitting those things and you understand them, and extending access, in terms of collaboration with your suppliers. They're key principles that really have not changed, but it does require maybe some surge resource to start to look at that in the short term. And they're typically only prioritized when you typically will start from a regulation or a response to what we're already talking about. So the event has happened, how can we prevent it, right, again? Or a new regulation's coming, let's see how we can implement this. But it's becoming more and more frequent that we have to do this. So it's about, some organizations are thinking about, how do I stand this up, or how do I buy this, to your point, as a service, right, on an ongoing basis. There's some of the discussions that we're seeing proactively. There's just some ideas. I'll pause there.
Thanks, Darren. We'll come to some follow-ups on kind of what you've both been sharing as part of the Q&A. So some of these nice discussions and thoughts going forward as well here. But Harry, let's lead us through kind of the final piece here in the promotion of sub-tier transparency. This is kind of the last area that we're going to just dive into in a bit of depth, that we've seen kind of a particular relevance or interest from the membership base this year on what they've been focusing on, mitigating sub-tier risks. I would be better placed in setting you up for. Over to you.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, so the third and final part of this action plan that we've developed concerns the actions that teams can take to actually tackle sub-tier risks. And again, in the short term, what we see companies doing is taking some of those tactical measures, seeking signed declarations from their suppliers concerning their risk and compliance practices. Again, typically, if you're looking at something like forced labor, it's common for procurement teams to have their suppliers sign letters of attestation confirming that they don't use forced labor in their supply chains, for example, putting this in policy, code of conduct. There's obviously question marks over, some people question the reliability of those kind of documents, but it's nonetheless an important part of the overall kind of due diligence piece. In the medium term, it's kind of taking that a step further and moving from kind of seeking assurances from suppliers to developing or helping them to improve their practices. So developing targeted training materials to support them with their risk and compliance practices. And then in the long term, what we see companies doing is taking a kind of a more proactive approach. Darren, you talked there about this is often done in response to an issue, and everybody wants to be proactive, but often it's difficult to find the resources to do so. But some are doing that, implementing preemptive measures to make supply chains and supply base more resilient by design. And just to kind of wrap up this portion of it, I'll just talk through a couple of examples. So Darren, you talked a lot about education there, and there's one example from the research that we did this year that really shows the power of that educational approach. Following a 2023 ruling from the US Environmental Protection Agency concerning PFAS, or so-called forever chemicals, and restrictions on their use. One energy company that we work with began to survey their suppliers to understand the use of PFAS in their supply chains. They struggled over 5 months to get an 80% response rate, and they sent out to 300 vendors. So, they decided to revise their approach and take a more kind of educational approach to this, expand the reach with a webinar program that they delivered to 8,000 suppliers. And within 6 weeks, 1,200 of those have taken the survey. So really showing the value of education here in not only helping suppliers to understand their obligations under new and evolving regulations, but also helping the energy company itself to increase visibility of the use of these chemicals in their supply chains and help it manage risk accordingly. And another example of that longer term kind of play that I talked about in taking the kind of proactive risk management approach comes from the IT company Hewlett Packard Enterprise. Historically, 90% of their structural components were sourced in a single region. That wasn't just their direct suppliers, but also included subcomponents and certain raw materials as well. And in response to this, in 2023, HPE decided to diversify its supply chain and qualify new sources outside of China, around other countries in Southeast Asia. And Procurement Leaders members can access the project summary of this case study by going to the website. That outlines the steps that HPE took from kind of initial planning through to cost assessments and on-site audits and finally deployment, that showed the steps that they've taken to diversify the supply chain and reduce concentration risk, not just at the first tier, but across multiple tiers, and increase not only resilience as a result, but also the agility of the supply chain and the flexibility of it to be able to ramp up production as required. And Ian, that concludes my part of the presentation.
Thanks for sharing, Harry. Some really good examples there from the community. I think the HPE one in particular, we dove a bit deeper into that one as well with the Chief Procurement Officer Adam at the World Procurement Congress this year. He's got a fascinating kind of role and remit that actually looks at resilience and planning, not just for procurement, but for the entire organisation as part of his remit, which has seen an elevation of his role through some of the practices that he's put in, such as this, which has been interesting to see. But again, Darren, coming to you, just for comments here and what you're seeing from GEP's point of view.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of questions. We're going to maybe use this as an example. So there's a question around what steps would you take to diversify the supply base, right? So because I think as it relates to HPE, I think we're actually a partner involved in some of this as well. So it's quite apt, right? So your typical scenario where organization recognizes, look, there's a lot of risk, right? There's a lot of risk to supply continuity. There's risk to regulatory risk, right? So in this case, the organization went from having just global suppliers everywhere, thousands of suppliers, developing a regionalization strategy as an example. So the question around how do you go about what are the steps to think about how would you diversify the supply base? So one is understanding, it always starts with, where's your customer demand? Are you, no matter where you're buying from and service, where are you servicing and delivering to? In this case, you have three global regions, three regions of the world that made sense to this organization. So they looked at it and it's okay. So then how do we start to understand the risks in trade flows, in sanctions, and what sort of production capacities and quality are there available? So that is some good old fashioned, RFI, procurement research, category research, and identifying both from the existing supply base, do they have regional capabilities as opposed to dealing with you from one location, as an example. Looking at what production capacities you have in your own regions, and can you increase inventories if you needed to make some, while you're tactically making changes in moving supply chain, in moving suppliers and building up capacity. Moving from single vendor to multi-vendor. So, instead of supplying in this region, can you supply to 3, or do I need multiple vendors? And then how do I de-risk if one or two of those suppliers also has supply risks themselves? So we look at how you do, how you allocate supply. So don't put all your eggs in one basket in very simple terms. And also just understanding then, so the idea being that you go from having, I suppose, an unstructured supply chain into a structured one. We've defined that we have 3 regional delivery customer bases. So we want 3 supply chains, same volumes, just distributed regionally. You end up with a scenario where you have maybe you will still have large vendors who supply into all regions, but and then you'll have additional suppliers taking parts of the allocation across certain categories or commodities. That's a simple example of what was done in this case. But also when you're doing that, as you're going out and sourcing and renegotiating, you're then addressing, okay, so what compliance do I need to meet? Making sure you have supplier certifications that in place. So, how can you show me visibility and transparency to prevent child labor, fraud, right? Simple fraud, money laundering, right? Visibility into the ownership structures of organizations, and making sure that you have the right ownership and you understand who owns them, that are not kind of sanctioned organizations, entities, or individuals. And then basically just understanding just supply complexity, right? What is the criticality of those goods and or services? That's a simple segmentation exercise you do at the moment, right? You do when you start that exercise. So that's how we would typically, and in this organization, that's what was conducted, right? So you're addressing both the risks, you're regionalizing to meet, more to provide more supply continuity to your suppliers, and you're addressing ESG, other regulatory issues, both current and future planned ones, because we always think about the past, but also we need to be looking and thinking and understanding what regulation is coming globally and regionally, and that's also really an important factor to consider, because it's not just one. You'll be delivering into multiple regions with multiple different regulatory authorities, right? So that's one way to address it. And then I think there's a couple of other questions. If you want to, do you want to go on talk about? There's a question about training strategies. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I wonder if you can do twofold for me on this one as well, because there's 2 questions. One's about training strategies from an internal perspective, and we also had a question earlier on, a little bit also more about kind of how you embed kind of this approach kind of more upwards, kind of with your leadership team as well, and kind of get their buy-in. So I wonder if there's the twofold nature here of the team buy-in, but also the upward sell of this approach, Darren, that from your experience, kind of both working within organizations that you can share.
Yeah, so start with our own, so it's buyers and category knowledge, category awareness, right? So what do we need to be concerned about? And it starts internally. So, we've all come from being particular category of commodity buyers. So the training internally comes from understanding your own internal regulatory affairs, your own compliance teams, to understand what regulation is there in your business, right? So HR training on what are the employee regulations and visibility and transparency, and because that extends, for example, into ethical sourcing, child labor, right? Modern slavery acts, for example, understanding all of those. So that's, first of all, it's making sure you're going around your own organization and having your own teams trained. You understand what regulations, what environment we're trading in. Then it also is then about what I would say is that it's then, and that feeds into all our annual training as employees that we all typically get, right? But it's putting in specific pieces for the supply chain. So are you involved with suppliers and making decisions, making sure that we are standing up as procurement and making sure that that mandatory training is done and adding it with your audit colleagues, right? Use all the levers you can internally to make sure it becomes an auditable annual activity, right? Then you think about extending that and how we then start to collaborate with our suppliers, again, through your portal, right? But extending that training to your suppliers. So we talk about how we make sure that certification, or you mentioned there's questions about, you know, validity or enforceability of certifications from suppliers, just getting them to tick the box. Training, right? Spending time, you know, is that, you know, that can be 2 to 3 hours training per year. Right, making that self-service, making that recordable, but available to your suppliers. It's part of your onboarding process with your suppliers and part of your ongoing recertification of your suppliers. Right, that then feeds back into your. So you mentioned how do you build that into your own buy-in and support from your leadership. Right, so you need to tie that back to corporate social responsibility. We all have goals, right? At an enterprise level and leadership level. This is how, tying some of that back to showing that this is how we retain transparency, trust, right? The right brand, the right reputation. And this is what we do by extending that to both our suppliers and their suppliers, right? So that it provides visibility, but also we're investing in them and their awareness and education. They're just simple, practical steps that are really effective.
Fantastic. Thank you. Harry, on the broader kind of leadership piece, is there anything that you've seen from Procurement Leaders members as to kind of how they best work with within their organization to bring leadership into this conversation early and get that buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I'd point to some benchmarking research that we did earlier this year around the impact of, because I believe the question was to do with persuading leadership to include risk management as part of procurement's core function when they might perceive it as not being so. Right. So, we did some research earlier in the year which suggested that those procurement functions that did have risk management as part of their under their remit and had dedicated resources to the topic. Saw a reduced frequency and severity of supply disruptions when compared with those that did not have it as part of their responsibility with dedicated resources. So, you know, it's going to depend on potentially industry, maybe not universally applicable to all, but it suggests that there is, you know, at least the beginnings of a quite a strong business case for bringing that under the control of the procurement function.
Thanks, Harry. Let's move on to a couple of other areas for us to focus on. So we're not too much longer kind of time that we've got as a collective today. Another one we had in, and maybe this links a little bit to. Darren, you touched on a little bit because one of the questions we had in earlier on actually was about the US election results, and not for us to be answering anything in particularly political lens here, but it's more just what it means kind of from a trade and a tariffs perspective and on our global supply chains. Well, a question actually around evaluating the trade-offs between nearshoring and offshoring when considering sub-tier supply chain visibility. Kind of how do you evaluate that? Darren, I wonder if there's any of your experience you'd share there.
So nearshoring and offshoring always would, you know, so it does depend upon the category you're in question, but typically, you know, nearshoring can be sometimes, a lot of times, language dependent, right, versus offshoring, non-language dependent. Whether you do have nearshoring comes into play again about de-risking global supply, right? So whether that be geopolitical uncertainty, natural disasters, or risk of further of sanctions, for example, right? And tariffs, right? So that when you take that into your supply planning and you look at your supply risk. Depending upon what you're trying to, what is the outcome, right? So offshoring, typically, if you have, longer lead times, are not an issue. It's around bulk purchase. You're typically talking ocean freight if you're producing, or if you're offshoring services and management activities. It's more language dependent, right? So those activities come in when you evaluate those. And then into sub-tier supply chain. So typically, if it's within a region where you are, if it's near or shore to you, you tend to be, your potential suppliers in those markets will tend to be subject to similar regulation. So you a better chance of probably having visibility into tier 2 or tier 3 versus offshore, less visibility, harder to establish, harder to maintain. And typically what you find, for an existing global supply chains, that's where you're using partners to provide some of that supply chain visibility, offshore. So you have, subcontract QA, quality assurance programs that are out doing inspections and certifications for you, how you mitigate some of those. So it's about, overall total cost, supply complexity in terms of lead times, right? And then the trade-off then, is there any, is there language or regionalization in terms of delivery and potential mitigation of tariffs? They're the 4 areas I'd point to, and it's about evaluating and weighing those together.
Fantastic, thank you. We're not too far off time, and I want to make sure that we just cover a couple of last pieces. Harry, there's actually just one that's come in. I quite like this. Meta, Helen, Casapantanai, you've been very, very active in today's conversation, so thank you for your contributions. But interesting one, this educating suppliers. When did it become the responsibility of procurement to educate suppliers? And more philosophically, what entitles us to the position that we know better and will tell the supplier how to run their business? Harry, thoughts from you?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I don't envisage a situation that any company where they're educating their suppliers en masse. But, if you think about those suppliers that are subject to SRM, more kind of partnership type relationships, then, it's certainly an approach that we see applied in the Procurement Leaders membership. What entitles us to a position that we know better? I don't know if I have an answer to that question. It's a good one. Darren, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on the education piece.
Yeah, well, the education is about partnering. It's about collaboration with your partners. The more you can understand my business, the more you're probably better able to support me. So the education that we're referring to it's educating. I'm educating you as a supplier so that you really understand my business and my business environment, what regulations, what customer base, and what's important to them. I'm not trying to teach you how to do your business, but I'm trying to teach you the environment that we operate in. And in my own experience for being a buyer most of my life, the more time I spend with suppliers, it's about helping them, educate them to how to do more business with us, right? Helping us collaborate together, and help take down barriers and administration costs between us to get better opportunities. So it's not in any way trying to teach them how to do their business, but it's simple supplier education has always been, in my experience, it's always been there from a P2P perspective. It's always been there from sourcing and compliance perspective. I'm not trying to, you're dealing with salespeople, you're dealing with their own engineering people, you're dealing with their key product development people. That's really important to collaborate. That's the perspective.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. Thank you both of you for your answer and the candid answer on that one. Just last piece we're going to move on to, really, and Darren, you touched on a little bit of this before. I'd love to kind of get both of your thoughts as we move into a little bit of a look to next year. That middle line here that you see on 2025 ambitions of procurement leaders next year, we're going to be looking at how we do manage that melting pot or that web of regulatory change. Darren, you touched on this a bit earlier before, kind of how important it is for us to be looking and understanding the environment that we're in. Kind of regulation is going to be increasing kind of the amount that's landing on CPOs' desks, and there's a worry that from our community learns in talking to CPOs that there might be a retreat to compliance. So how can we support CPOs to ensure that they don't fall back into fulfilling kind of more of a compliance first role? So that's where procurement leaders will spend an awful lot of its focus next year. Maybe just for both of you, kind of what why is it kind of that you think we need to spend a lot more time or or whether we put some more of why are we putting more of a focus in this area for next year. Harry, from your perspective, why is it so important for members to really kind of be nuts and bolts understanding this?
Well, I think, as we've said, it's a driver of a lot of the work that teams are having to do on resilience, on ESG issues. So it's just really about understanding the environment that you're operating in. We work with multinational organizations. The chances are they're not sourcing or selling in just one region. They're having to cater to different regulatory regimes around the world, many of which, as I said at the beginning, don't necessarily speak to each other and kind of gel exactly with one another. So it's a really complex landscape, and I think there's certainly from a research and networking perspective, I think that's got a lot of room to run, that topic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Darren, from GEP's point of view, kind of as you look at how to support kind of customers next year with the regulatory kind of lens to it, there's so much to focus on. But kind of what's kind of top of mind for you here that people should be thinking about next year?
Yeah, so ever increasing regulation is a concern on everybody's mind. And I do echo completely. We see it in particular industries. So, financial services is one particularly that's just more and more financial regulation, that the risk of the procurement function adding less value, right, other than compliance, right? So one of the key areas, not just for that and for all industries, people are asking, so I need to always understand regulation, but how can I use tools and how can I use, there's a lot of topics around AI and things at the moment, right, to think about, well, how can I use that to continue to free up or keep the same capacity that I have to really add value in procurement? So how can I use that to help me understand, mitigate, and manage the compliance activities and regulations, so that, but it still gives me the ability to really act and be a strategic procurement person that really adds value with your suppliers and your stakeholders. That, I think, would be a good challenge to see if we are to sit here in 12 months' time, how many of us have taken the regulations, have resolved those in terms of making sure that your compliant business is operating, while freeing up capacity in our day-to-day jobs to focus on real supply chain and procurement activities and adding value.
That's what it's all about, right? The freeing up of ensuring that we can have the proper strategic value that that we need to make an impact. So fantastic! Thank you both so much. It's been a really, really interesting almost last hour with both of you, diving into some key and critical areas and this focus of resilience for us. And it's only going to continue with a lot more of the conversations that we've got here at Procurement Leaders going into Q1 for next year, and how we're supporting both the CPO community and across all the aspects of the procurement leadership team there as well. So some of the things we look forward to on our content community calendar. As mentioned, though, this has been interactive today, so please do look out for the rest of the webinar coming up in the remainder of the year, and let us know your feedback. We can also download the report as well in partnership with GEP Procurement Leaders that we've kind of previewed a little bit here today. So do have a look at that to help set your teams up for success with a quick start to next year in this space. And also, this webinar has been on demand. Not everybody can always attend all the webinars at any given moment. So this is for review and to watch afterwards for all of your teams. Please do pass that on for what I'm sure will be useful for all of them. So a big thank you to Darren and to Harry and to GEP for their partnership on this across the course this year on the work that we've done in resilience in this particular glide path bit of research. And we'll look forward to hopefully seeing everybody again in the very near future. So Darren, Harry, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your afternoons, your mornings, wherever you are today. I'll see everybody again soon.
Thank you all. Enjoy your day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.